I never thought I'd be the kind of person to tell a story like this. For most of my life, I was the quiet guy in the corner, the one who kept to himself, lived simple, worked remotely, and found peace in silence. But silence isn't what it used to be. It's no longer a place of rest for me. Now it feels like a veil, thin enough that something is always pressing against the other side. My cabin is about 40 minutes outside Spokane, Washington. If you've ever driven these back roads in late fall, you know how the forest changes its voice after dark. The wind stops being wind, it becomes a murmur threading through the trees. Shadows stop being shadows, they become questions with no answers. I thought I understood those woods. I'd spent 5 years there, ever since my divorce, convincing myself that solitude was healing. 12 acres of dense pine and fir, with a narrow creek cutting across the back, and not a neighbor in sight. Just me, my German Shepherd Rex, and the forest. 2 years ago, I installed a set of security cameras. Not because I feared burglars, nobody drives out this far without a reason, but because I wanted to see what wandered past when I wasn't looking. Elk at the tree line, coyotes drifting through the creek bed, sometimes a black bear nosing around the garbage. The cameras gave me little glimpses of the wild, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. But what they caught last October, that was no reminder. That was intrusion. It started quietly. Late nights in September, I'd hear heavy steps on gravel, too slow and deliberate for a deer. Sometimes it was only one or two, then a pause, then another. I'd get up, look out the window, and see the floodlight over the truck blazing against nothing but empty air. No figure, no movement. Just the sudden halt of the night's natural rhythm. The crickets muted, the owls gone, as if the woods themselves were pulling the curtain shut. At first, I thought it was a bear. They roam here in fall, fattening before the snow. But the sounds didn't match. Bears are clumsy. They crash through things. This was measured. Like someone testing the edges of my property, stopping only when they knew I was listening. Rex felt it before I did. He's a good dog, steady, disciplined, the kind you trust to stand firm if something charges out of the brush. But that month he changed. He paced in circles, whined at windows, and refused to step off the deck at night. His ears would lock on to the tree line, as if he heard a frequency I couldn't. Sometimes he would press his nose to the door and just stay there, tail tucked, trembling. That's when the smell arrived. You can't describe it properly without experiencing it yourself. It wasn't the rot of a carcass, though that was my first thought. It was closer to sweat animal sweat, but layered with wet moss and iron, the kind of stench that feels alive, like something exhaling its presence into you. It hung at the edge of the property, drifting in on the wind, until I started dreading the simple act of stepping outside. On October 10th, 4 days before the night I can't forget, I found the first print. A muddy patch by the mailbox, softened by rain. I almost walked past it, thinking bear. But when I set my boot beside it, my chest went hollow. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide, deep enough that whatever made it had to weigh more than half a ton. And the toes, they weren't claws. They were spread wide, ridged, almost human. Almost. I took photos. I researched online. And that was the first night I felt the grip of fear I couldn't reason away. There are 1,000 prints just like it archived across the Pacific Northwest, each debated into dust by skeptics and believers alike. But this wasn't a photo on someone else's screen. This was in my driveway. This was circling my home. In the following days, more appeared along the creek, outside the bedroom window, once in the soft dirt beneath the deck. That one stopped me cold. To see the impression of something enormous standing where I slept only a few feet above, it was like waking to find fingerprints on your throat. Then came October 13th. I remember it clearer than any birthday, any holiday. It was just after 2 a.m. Rex had been restless all night, whining so softly it almost sounded like whispering. I checked the cameras out of habit, scrolling through 4 windows of grainy night vision. At first, it was empty. Then I noticed the shadows. One wasn't moving with the others. Something stood just inside the edge of light, half hidden by a tree. Too broad for a man, too still for a bear. My breath locked in my chest as I watched it shift. Not clumsy, not random, calculated. From tree to tree, just far enough to remain a shape, just close enough to remind me it was real. I stared until my eyes burned, and finally it melted back into the dark. The next morning, fresh prints trailed from the tree line to within 15 feet of the house, closer than it had ever dared. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't passing by. It was circling, testing, measuring. That evening, I barricaded doors, checked locks twice, dragged a chair across the back door I rarely used. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep inside I felt it building. As if all the strange silences, the smells, the tracks, they were leading here to a night I wasn't ready for. By 11:47 p.m., my cameras proved me right. I'll never forget the time stamp. The glow of the patio light caught it perfectly. A figure standing less than 10 feet away from where I lay in bed. 8 feet tall, shoulders like the beams of a bridge, its head too small for the enormity beneath it. And those hands huge, long-fingered, tracing the frame of the sliding door like a locksmith learning his craft. It pressed its face near the glass, close enough that I could see the fog of its breath blur the camera lens. Rex growled from beside the bed, but he didn't bark. He knew better. He was trembling so hard the floor seemed to hum beneath him. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I couldn't move. My body betrayed me, every nerve locked between awe and terror. Watching something that shouldn't exist, studying me through the barrier of glass. A boundary thinner than a heartbeat. It circled the house that night. Every door, every window, every weakness tested. Quiet, deliberate, as if the walls were nothing more than puzzles it hadn't solved yet. And when it finally left, disappearing into the black, I realized that survival wasn't luck. It was mercy, and mercy doesn't last forever. The morning after felt unreal, like I'd woken inside someone else's skin. My body was heavy, my movements slow, but my mind refused to rest. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, Rex trailing me with his head low, ears pinned back. The tracks were everywhere, pressed deep into the soil, circling the foundation, crisscrossing paths where no person had a reason to walk. At the sliding door, I found scratches, 4 long gouges cut into the metal frame, sharp enough to catch light. They weren't random scrapes. They were deliberate, as if something had tested whether the barrier would give way if pressed hard enough. The strangest part was the order. My garbage cans, usually knocked over when bears came through, were opened with care. The lids weren't tossed aside, but leaned neatly against the wall. Inside, only the meat scraps were gone. Packages torn open with precision, not teeth. It felt less like an animal looking for food and more like someone choosing what they wanted. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like the owner of this land. I felt like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with my laptop open, all 4 camera feeds glowing. I had a baseball bat in reach, though I knew it was ridiculous. What good was a piece of wood against something that could fold me in half? My phone was charged, my shotgun loaded, but I doubted either would matter if the door slid open. By midnight, the woods were alive with absence. No crickets, no owls, just a low hum. I first thought was the refrigerator until I unplugged it. The sound didn't stop. It was faint, metallic, like a machine buried under the soil. Steady enough that I felt it in my bones more than I heard it. Rex whimpered at the window, staring toward the creek. His hackles rose like bristles. At 12:36, camera 2 flickered. The motion light flared, and in that split second, I caught a glimpse. A shadow stepped into the yard, massive, upright, with movements too fluid for its size. It didn't rush. It didn't stumble. It walked with patience, as though it knew time itself was its ally. My breath fogged against the laptop screen as I leaned in closer. The figure stopped at my truck. I watched its outline bend, arms stretching along the metal, like it was learning the shape of the vehicle. One enormous hand wrapped around the handle of the door. For a terrifying moment, I thought it would pull it open, but it didn't. It let go, traced the edge of the window with its fingertips, then stepped back. A whisper of motion, heavy enough to bend the weeds, and then gone again. I sat frozen, waiting for it to return, every muscle locked. The minutes dragged and nothing moved. Then, at 1:07, the front door rattled. Soft at first, then firmer. The sound of weight testing wood, hinges groaning under a steady pressure. Rex went silent, crouched low, trembling. I gripped the bat so tight my knuckles cracked. Through the peephole, I saw only the faint glow of the porch light on wood grain. But in the reflection of the glass, there was something else. A shape leaning close, watching through the slit of space that separated inside from out. The rattling stopped. 3 knocks followed, slow, intentional, a rhythm too careful to be accident. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry as ash. Whoever or whatever stood there knew I was listening. It knocked again. 3 beats, silence. 3 more. The sound was softer than thunder, but heavier than any human hand. It was thunder wrapped in fur. I stayed that way until the knocks stopped. Hours passed before the first bird dared to call. When daylight finally seeped through the curtains, I opened the door. On the porch was a wet smear of soil shaped like a handprint, far too large to belong to any man. 5 fingers, spread wide, pressed into the wood. Not smudged, not vague. Clear enough that I could trace the lines. I stood there, staring, the cold morning air biting my face. The world looked the same, the trees, the creek, the distant ridges, but I knew it wasn't. I knew something had crossed a threshold between story and reality, and it had left its hand on my door to prove it. And in that moment, The question that terrified me most wasn't what is it? The question was, what does it want with me? The days that followed blurred into a strange kind of half-life. I kept working, tapping away at my laptop, but the keystrokes felt mechanical. Every sound from the forest pulled my eyes to the window. Every shadow on the cameras became a threat. Sleep was fractured, broken by the memory of those knocks, echoing like a drumbeat stitched into the walls of the house. Rex barely ate. He'd spend hours pressed against the front door, not barking, not moving, just listening. His body trembled with a tension that never released. Sometimes he'd glance at me as if asking why I was still here, why we hadn't left, and I couldn't answer him. Part of me wanted to pack the truck and drive until the pines gave way to open plains. But another part, the part that kept me glued to the cameras, frame by frame, needed to know. Needed to see what I was really dealing with. On October 18th, something changed. That night, the hum returned, the same metallic vibration I'd heard before, low and steady, like a machine buried beneath the creek bed. It crawled through the floorboards, a pulse that seemed to slow my heartbeat to match its rhythm. I muted the laptop just to be sure it wasn't feedback, but the sound was inside the cabin itself, in the walls, in me. Camera 3 picked it up first. A figure moved along the tree line, just far enough to be mistaken for a shadow, but too deliberate in its pace. I zoomed in until the pixels bled into each other, and then I saw the eyes. Not glowing like an animal's in the light, but catching and holding it, like wet stones reflecting fire. They didn't blink, they didn't dart. They watched. It circled, slow and unhurried, as if mapping the house for the 100th time. But then, for the first time, it stepped into the clearing fully. No cover, no hesitation. The porch light caught its outline, and the sight rooted me to the floor. 8 feet, maybe taller, its shoulders swallowing the space around it. The fur was darker than the night behind it, except where damp patches caught the light like oil on water. But it wasn't just the size, it was the way it moved. Each step was measured, fluid, almost careful, like a hunter who already knew the end of the story. Rex whimpered, his body pressing against my leg, his nails scraping the floor as if trying to anchor himself. The creature walked to the edge of the deck, and instead of touching the door, it crouched. Its massive hands pressed flat to the wood, palms down, fingers splayed. And then it tilted its head, ear against the porch, as though listening through the grain. My heart stopped. Because at that moment I realized it wasn't just interested in the house. It was trying to hear me. I stayed frozen, afraid even my breathing might betray me. The hum in the air deepened, vibrating in my teeth and my chest. The camera's glitched lines of static slicing across the feeds, and for a few seconds all I could see was white noise. When the image returned, the porch was empty. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to peek outside. The yard was still empty, painted in the gray wash of moonlight, but then I noticed movement at the creek. Something tall, darker than the tree line, bending low as if scooping water. My camera angle barely caught it, just a silhouette, hunched and massive. I should have left it there, should have stepped back, but curiosity can be heavier than fear. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the back door a crack, and aimed the beam toward the creek. The light caught eyes, 2 burning reflections staring back across the distance, locked onto mine the moment the beam found them. Not startled, not fleeing. A recognition, as if it had been waiting for me to look. The hum cut out instantly. Silence fell so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. Then the eyes blinked. Once. Slow. And in that blink, the flashlight flickered and died. I stood in the doorway, swallowed by blackness, the smell of damp fur rolling toward me on the breeze. And in that perfect dark, I heard it. Not knocks, not footsteps, a whisper, low, guttural, close enough that the hairs on my neck rose as though breath had brushed them. I couldn't understand the words, but the weight of them sank into me, heavy as stone. A whisper that weighed 1,000 pounds. And I knew whatever this was, it wasn't done with me. I don't remember how long. I stood in that doorway after the whisper, seconds, minutes, maybe longer. The dark had a thickness to it, like it was pressing against me, and I was afraid if I moved, it would break open. Rex pressed against my leg, trembling so hard I felt it through my jeans. He never once barked. Whatever was out there, he knew it was beyond warning off. When I finally shut the door and locked it, my hand shook so badly I could barely turn the bolt. The rest of that night was a blur of static cameras, faint movement I couldn't fully make out, and that smell seeping in through the cracks of the cabin walls. Musky, metallic, alive. It clung to my lungs like smoke. By sunrise, the prints were everywhere again, circling tighter, overlapping in patterns that didn't make sense. But on the porch, where I'd heard the whisper, something new had appeared. Not just a print, a mark, scratched into the wood, long grooves that almost looked like symbols. Not letters I recognized, not random claw marks either. They had direction, shape, purpose. I stared at them until the light shifted, and I realized I was shaking, because it wasn't just passing by anymore. It was leaving a message. That day, I called the university team, the researchers who had agreed to review my footage. They'd promised to send someone out within the week. But part of me already knew it wouldn't matter. This thing wasn't coming for them. It was coming for me. The final night I saw it, October 28th fit, didn't creep in shadows or knock in riddles. It walked straight up to my front door and stood there. I watched on the camera, too afraid to move as its massive frame filled the porch. It didn't try the handle this time. It didn't scrape or test. It just leaned forward, pressing its face close to the camera. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. The skin beneath the fur was dark, almost gray. The brow heavy, the mouth set in something between curiosity and hunger. But the eyes, those eyes were human in a way that made my stomach turn. Not kind, not savage, just aware. A gaze that told me it knew exactly what it was doing to me. It stayed like that for almost an hour, breathing slow, fogging the lens with each exhale. Rex lay flat against the floor, silent as though pretending not to exist. And then, without warning, it lifted one hand and pressed it flat against the door, right where I had been standing nights before. The wood groaned under its weight. The prints of its fingers smeared across the glass, and I swear, in that silence, I felt its hand pressing against my chest, even though it never crossed inside. Then it turned, no rush, no panic, just a slow step back into the dark. The porch light flickered, the camera glitched, and when the feed returned, the space was empty. It never came back. The researchers arrived days later. They cast the prints, photographed the scratches, analyzed every second of footage. Their words were careful, technical, the kind that circle around what they can't explain. They admitted the evidence was compelling. They admitted it couldn't be hoax or bear, but they wouldn't say the word, not out loud. I didn't push them, because by then I understood something they didn't. It hadn't left because I scared it off. It hadn't left because it lost interest. It left because it chose to, because it wanted me to know it could come back any night it pleased. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake to silence too heavy for the forest. I check the cameras, the porch, the creek. Empty. Always empty. But I can't shake the sense that somewhere out there, in those endless woods, something is waiting, watching, listening. Not an animal. Not a man. A whisper that still presses against the edges of my dreams. And I know it hasn't forgotten me.